everyone. My name is Frida Faisal, and I'm a New York City, Brooklyn-based Jewish YouTuber with an interest in all things Jewish, subcultures, religion, New York City, and human interest stories. Today, we are going to talk about the National Desertion Bureau. Popular stereotypes about Jewish husbands are usually positive. They are loyal, they're good providers, they don't drink to excess, and they aren't violent. It's no wonder that most people have never heard of the National Desertion Bureau, an agency created in New York in 1911 to track down runaway Jewish husbands and bring them to justice. It turns out that the era of Jewish mass migration from Eastern Europe to North America was accompanied by terrible cultural and social upheaval, poverty, and failure. One sad feature of this era was the phenomenon of broken families, which occurred on a mass scale. The problem of Jewish men abandoning their families was so severe that along with the National Desertion Bureau, Yiddish newspapers like the Forwards, with a daily readership in the hundreds of thousands, published a popular column called The Gallery of Missing Husbands, which featured mugshots and descriptions of men who had left their wives and families in the lurch. There were even local psychics on the Lower East Side who specialized in tracking down missing husbands. Addressing a true social epidemic in the Jewish community, the National Desertion Bureau worked with a multiplicity of governmental and private organizations to find these men and force them to pay alimony, child support, and serve jail time if they didn't. From 1905 through the 1960s, the Bureau tracked more than 18,000 cases. Its files are rich in details and are often short novellas unto themselves, with details on the tragedy of marital dissolution, abandoned children, and financial ruin. The YIVO archive houses approximately 17,000 National Desertion Bureau case files that were generated between 1905 and the 1950s. YIVO put together an exhibition on this called Runaway Husbands, Desperate Families, the Story of the National Desertion Bureau, which traces the history of the National Desertion Bureau and includes never-before-seen records, documents, and photographs from the organization's voluminous archives. This was a project curated by Eddy Portnoy from YIVO. I've had the great pleasure of having Eddy on my program before when we discussed the Yiddish language, and today Eddy will share with us an in-depth story of this dark episode. Before we begin, I want to take just a moment to thank those of you who are members of this channel. Members of this channel help make this work possible. It's very time-consuming work. I publish videos early for members, so I get to interact early with those of you who are members, and I thank you so very much. And now, Eddy, thank you so very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Frida. It's a pleasure to be, invited back.
Yeah, I'm happy you're back. It's been too long. That conversation about Yiddish, people loved it. People were absolutely fascinated by it.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, look, Yiddish is interesting.
We're biased, but I think so.
Yeah, I guess we are biased. Language, I think, is interesting as a whole. And so, Yiddish, because it's something close to home, it's even more interesting.
It's even more interesting. So let's talk about this project of the National Desertion Bureau, which is mind-blowing. And did you write that, the whole description I lifted off of the exhibition?
Yeah.
Plagiarism?
I wrote something, and then the woman who handles the website and social media probably worked on it. But that's, I wrote most of that.
That was very interesting.
It's a fascinating organization, and the phenomenon is also interesting, and it's not something that people are terribly familiar with. I think that when people talk about, the great mass migration of Jews to the United States from Eastern Europe, and this begins, before the 1880s, when they talk about mass migration, it's from 1881 to 1924. And it's a period where approximately 2 million Jews came to North America from Eastern Europe. And that's an enormous number. The vast majority of them settled in and around New York, and that migration created places like the Lower East Side, which for many people was the Plymouth Rock. It was sort of the first location of residence for many Jews. And, I think by the 1920s, there were something like 500,000 Jews living just on the Lower East Side. This doesn't include Brooklyn, Harlem, other places in the Bronx, other places in and around New York City. And so the Lower East Side was this roiling urban ghetto that was mostly populated by Jews. And at the time, Jews made up about 20% of New York City's population, which is a lot.
What is the percent now?
The percent is lower, and I want to say it's like 10, 12% now, which is still a lot considering the Jews in the world are a tiny minority. But in the 20s, in the interwar period between the two world wars, this was the time when you had like a Yiddish mass media. You had 5 daily newspapers in Yiddish. And obviously print media is the only media. Now there's like a zillion different kinds of media, and it's all very confusing. But you had Yiddish theaters, you had synagogues and stiebels of all different sorts. Every block had, I mean, it was just a totally different, the world is like, Jeden sind eingepackt in ein Gegend. Jews were like really crammed into one little area, and it created its own kind of unique culture. In addition to that, they were very poor. Well, that's one of the funny things or the odd things about this mass migration. In Eastern Europe, they were also very poor. And to a large degree, that's why they came to the United States. Certainly they were pushed along by the fact that they were oppressed and socially ostracized. They didn't have civil rights in many places. They had to, for many years, they had to pay special taxes on certain things, on meat, on candles, or wax, they're treated very much as a separate minority in Eastern Europe, especially under Russian rule. And so when it became apparent that America was accepting large numbers of immigrants, the Jews took them up on that. So many came. And what's interesting about this immigration is when most people think about it, it's considered something very successful. And what that means is Jewish immigrants came here. They sent their kids to school. Their kids went to college. Large swaths of them became professionals, meaning doctors, dentists, lawyers, accountants, whatever. And within 1-2 generations, Jews who had come here, who worked in sweatshops, who worked in the garment industry, who were peddlers on the street, and still very poor. That immigrant generation was very, very poor. They succeeded in launching their children into the American middle class. And so as a result, it's considered very, very successful immigration. And I think that it's accurate to say that. But along the way, there were certain things that transpire in which Jews encountered, Jewish immigrants and American-born Jews as well, who were born in immigrant neighborhoods. They encountered difficulties. Crime was a big problem in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side. There were lots of Jewish gangs and gangsters and criminals. I talked about percentages. New York City was about 20% Jewish, 1920s. So as a result, Sing Sing prison was also about 20% Jewish at the time.
Wow.
So when you're successful and you make it to the middle class, there are certain things you forget historically because they're embarrassing. You don't really want to know about them. It's not something you want to dwell on because it's sort of a blip in what's ultimately a really nice success story.
Yeah.
But these blips, they interest me as a historian.
Yeah, well, they're part of what happened.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And so, but there's been a tendency to kind of, certainly, there have been books written on, Jewish criminals and gangsters and mafia and things like that. My own personal interest is in the people who were even at a lower level. And so the only real record of those activities is the Yiddish press, which is full of all kinds of stories of Jews running into problems, whether it's crime or whether it's a broken marriage or broken home or business failure. The Yiddish press is the sounding board for this kind of activity. Historically, it's just really fascinating. And so the National Desertion Bureau is a great example of this kind of phenomenon. Just generally, it's not an unknown organization among historians. I think that for people, Jews who may know a bit about history or even a fair amount about history, may not have ever heard of it. And they may not have known that there was a problem with this immigrant generation, mostly men who were abandoning their wives and families, that it was a fairly severe social problem that affected the Jewish immigrant community. And I should also add that this affected every community. The difference is that it was treated differently. And so at the time, there were lots of Irish and Italian immigrants in New York City. They had problems at a similar level, but they viewed family abandonment as a moral issue that the church had to deal with. And the National Desertion Bureau saw it differently. They saw it as a social issue, a social problem that could be dealt with by social workers and lawyers, and administrative professionals, which is just a different way to view it.
Mm.
Go backward a bit. the way this happened, the National Board of Jewish Charities, which was a large umbrella organization for all kinds of different Jewish charities, they noted in sort of internal documents in 1902 that this issue was becoming a problem in the Jewish community. Women and children were being abandoned by men who were running off to different cities, different states, sometimes just different neighborhoods. So it was on their radar. One interesting note is that one of the ways that I found out about this was I was doing research on a particular psychic, a very well-known Jewish psychic by the name of Abraham Hochman, who lived on the Lower East Side, and he was a fortune teller. And a huge amount of his business was based on his claim that he was a master at finding runaway husbands. And so there were newspaper articles about him in the Yiddish press and even in the English press as well, because it was a fascinating human interest story. They write about how there would be women lined up outside of his stoop on Rivington Street in the morning waiting to hear where their husbands might be. And he loved getting publicity and loved being written about in the papers. And so there are all these interesting articles. So there's a 1902 article, I think it's maybe it could be 1903, in which a woman appears in his salon or in his office on Rivington Street and is looking for her husband, and he reads her fortune and he tells her that her husband will be at the corner of Pitt and Grand Streets at 10 p.m. that night.
Hey.
And he tells her, he says, if he's not there, I will pay you $50, which like in 1902, 1903, that's
a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. So she goes to the local police station and finds a police officer and tells him this. He may have gone just out of curiosity. She explains that, she's been abandoned by her husband and she's been left destitute and she has children that she has to take care of and she has no funding for them. And so she brings this police officer to Pitt and Grand at 10 p.m. And in fact, her husband is there.
Wow.
Like leaning against a lamppost. And the police officer arrests him and brings him to court. And the judge says that he's got to pay a certain amount weekly in alimony or in child support, rather. And it's this interesting and somewhat odd story that appears in the paper.
What's the logical explanation?
So Abraham Hochman pulled other kind of similar stunts. There was another episode where there was a group of Jewish kids from the neighborhood had gotten arrested for burglary, and they were in court being arraigned. And Hochman walks into the courtroom and yells out, "I'm paying bail for these kids." And the judge looks at him and he says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm a clairvoyant, and I know that tomorrow you will set them free." And the judge says, "Okay, if you want to pay bail, you could pay bail." So he pays their bail. The next day he comes back and the judge sets them free. And I don't know if he had gotten word that they didn't actually do it. Like, who knows? I don't.
Yeah. Okay. I see. I see.
Or maybe he had, special talent.
He had special power. I tend on the more suspicious side of things.
Yeah. I tend to be skeptical of these things as well. But it makes for a good story.
Yeah. Oh.
And he's a fascinating character. In addition to being a fortune teller, he owned a wedding hall. He had his own ketubas printed up that he sold at the wedding hall. He also published his own Haggadah called like the Fortune Teller's Haggadah. It's so funny because there are advertisements in the Haggadah for people in the neighborhood. I suspect that he owned a decent amount of real estate on his street. And so a lot of the business people on his street were paying him rent. And he got them to advertise in the Haggadah. There's, a local photographer whose ad is in there. There's also, and this is actually perfect for Pesach, there's a doctor down the block from him that specializes in cures for constipation, which like to put that right in the Haggadah is what you need for this particular holiday. So it's really, he's a great character. He's really funny. But like I said, his specialty was finding missing husbands. And so this appears in the papers. And I think that this is just a fascinating topic. And so at the time, like I mentioned, that the National Board of Jewish Charities, they discovered that around that same time, a few years after the turn of the 20th century, that this is a problem with the immigrant Jewish community. And in fact, in 1905, the National Board of Jewish Charities creates an organization called, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like a Society for the Protection of Abandoned Women and Children, or Deserted Women and Children, something like that. And this was a charitable organization that women with families could go to and get funds to live on. After a few years of doing that, the National Board of Jewish Charities realizes that it's not a good system, because what's happening is that they're giving money to families whose fathers and husbands have left them, and as a result, they become dependent on the charity, because the husbands, if they become aware that their families are being funded, they don't bother sending them money or giving them anything in any way. So they realized that they had to take a different tack. And so it doesn't happen until about 5-6 years later. But in the meantime, it becomes such a problem that it becomes very common to see in Yiddish papers advertisements from abandoned families saying, our husband, Shlomi Shlapotnik, whatever, I don't want to give a real name because it could be someone's name. He explained that our husband and father has left us. We're destitute. We have no way to make a living. He is originally from such and such a place. We think he may have gone to Cleveland or St. Louis or Los Angeles or wherever. And they want people to find them, and so they could get supported in some way. They wanted support. And so what happens is the Yiddish Vorwärts, which at the time had become the largest and most successful and important Yiddish paper, in 1908, they start it's not daily when it starts, but it becomes very regular very quickly. They start a column called the Galerie von Verschwundene Männer, the Gallery of Missing Men. And what they do is they put in mugshots of the men. Obviously, women are sending in mugshots, or they're sending in photographs. They're putting these like little pictures, and they usually set them up as like 6 people in a row. And below them are descriptions of them, what town in Europe they're from, what their jobs are, where they think they went. They mention the families that they left. And the idea was that the public, it was really kind of a way of crowdsourcing, in which the idea was to turn these guys in, bring them to justice. They had done something terrible. They abandoned their wives and families. And the Vorwärts starts this column. And what's interesting is it becomes very popular. It's like the page that the people first turn to, because they want to see if their neighbors, friends, and relatives are like in the Galeria von Verschwundene Männer, if they're in this, if they're in these mugshots. And so it becomes popular, and, Yiddish humor magazines do parodies of it. And then in 1911, the National Desertion Bureau creates the Jewish Board of Charities, the National Jewish Board of Charities creates the National Desertion Bureau. And the purpose of it is to find missing husbands who have gone who knows where. And it's run by 2 attorneys, Charles Zunzer and Monroe Goldstein, and it's staffed by social workers. And they open up offices on 2nd Avenue in the Lower East Side, and they're written about in the paper, and they put in advertisements in the paper explaining what they do, and they say that women can come to them, and their purpose, their mandate is to find these missing men and bring them to justice and to fund these women. The way it worked is like if a woman was abandoned, she would go into the office and fill out an application. And it was sort of small 4-column application. And it had basic information, names, addresses, names of children, where people are from, why they think the man abandoned them.
What kind of answers would they give?
So this was actually a really interesting part of the exhibit. So within the exhibit itself, there are two large, I want to say 18-inch wide columns in the exhibit space. And so we took those, and from floor to ceiling, we put like thousands of reasons as to why they left. So the National Desertion Bureau was created by the National Board of Jewish Charities, which is now something called the Jewish Board. And in fact, the Jewish Board, which still is a Jewish charitable organization, they sponsored the exhibit. And one of the things that they did was they extracted all of these reasons out of the applications just because I think they thought it was interesting. And I have a list of them here, and I could read you some of them.
Yeah, let's hear some of them. That sounds so interesting.
Yeah, some of them are really fascinating. So infidelity. One woman wrote, cannot account for desertion. Another wrote, man threatened to kill her. Another, man suffers from hallucinations regarding the applicant's morality. Man claims his wife is disagreeable. Man is a Gentile. Man absconded when his wife learned that he was Jewish. So you have both sides of that story. Man stole money and jewelry, feared arrest, absconded. Man embezzled money and left. Man annoying children after divorce obtained in 1915. Man's polygamous nature.
What does that mean? Cheating?
Man's polygamous nature, it's a man who got married multiple times. There are also some cases where women abandon men, although the vast majority of them are men who abandon women. Let's see. Here's one. Husband was young and irresponsible.
Oh.
The woman ousted him from her home. One wanted to escape military service. Extreme jealousy on the husband's part. Sexual incompatibility. The wife refused to keep borders. Man rakes over woman's past. I mean, there was one of my favorites was woman didn't like Baltimore. Moved to Baltimore, she didn't like it. And that's what's so interesting about this particular archive and these applications is that they give you insight into the family and marital problems of common people. And as a historian, that's interesting because you don't typically get details about common people unless it's in the newspapers or, the cases are unique. Like history is typically written about, humanity's great people, most successful people, business people, doctors, artists, writers, politicians. Those are the people who make history, as opposed to just your average person who works a job, has a family, lives a life, doesn't produce anything of note. And that's really the vast majority of people. Obviously, because of the internet, everyone is visible.
Yeah.
But prior to this, nobody knew from these people. And it's just such a fascinating look into their lives. Sometimes the files give you very granular detail about these stories and how they played out. And you also learn all kinds of things about these people. One fascinating side note is these files are a gold mine for people working in genealogy. Anyone who's researching family history, if you have a family, if you have an ancestor that is in these files,
you have a ton of information.
You could really find out a lot. You could find out what they worked in. First of all of the standard immigration information that you can find in other places, but it's all focused here. But it's also what languages they spoke, if they went to school, cheder, yeshiva, what towns they were from. The level of detail is really pretty fascinating. I can give you one example of which it's one of the stories that we featured in the exhibit. It was the Goldfarbs. It was a family by the name of Nathan and Lena Goldfarb. And they lived on the Upper East Side, not in like the fancy Upper East Side. They lived on like 93rd Street, East 93rd Street. Nathan was a watchmaker, which is, you're not in a sweatshop. It's a slightly higher level job. And they had 3 children, all of whom were under 6 years old. They also had an extra room in their apartment, which they rented to a boarder by the name of Minnie Schechter. So one day, Lena comes home and she catches Minnie and Nathan in the act.
I see.
And of course, no one's happy with this situation. And so what happens is Nathan and Minnie
take off, abscond.
They run away. But what happens is this leaves Lena and the 3 children with nothing. She doesn't have a job. She can't pay rent. She can't buy groceries. The kids aren't in, maybe one, I don't know, one of them may have started kindergarten, but it's a terrible situation. And she has no way to support herself. This case takes place, incidentally, in 1912. So she goes to the offices of the National Desertion Bureau. She gives them a photograph and she fills out an application describing him, saying where he's from, how they met, when they got married, what languages he speaks, what jobs he's done, who they know. Because the National Desertion Bureau it's almost like an investigations agency for immigrant Jews.
Like private eyes.
Yeah, they initiated an investigation. They're social workers, and they know the names of the man's family members who are in the country, and they send people out to interview family members and coworkers, and they get no information. And so what they do is they take his photograph and they send it to the Vorwärts so it can be placed in the Galerie von Verschwundene Männer, in the Gallery of Missing Husbands. And so that appears a few months later. In the meantime, Lena moves to a cheaper apartment on the Lower East Side. And one of the interesting documents in the file is her business card. And her business card is in Yiddish. but it's in sort of an English Yiddish. And what she did is she rented a small apartment on the Lower East Side and opened up a kosher restaurant in the apartment. It's a non-licensed, it's illegal. You're technically not supposed to do this. It's not a real restaurant, but it's basically an unlicensed restaurant in an apartment. And she probably went around the Lower East Side giving out this card to, workers in the neighborhood who could come for a kosher lunch. And it was a way for her to earn money and work and watch her children at the same time. Yeah. Because if she goes to work at a factory, she's got to get a babysitter or she's got to put her children with another family, which is a difficult situation. So this was really kind of a clever way for a woman to be able to watch her children and work at the same time and make a living. So in the meantime, the picture and description of Nathan Goldfarb goes up in the Gallery of Missing Husbands. And a few months later, the forwards gets a letter which they sent to the National Desertion Bureau that says, I have seen this man going around with a woman he claims with his wife in Los Angeles. And he works at such and such a factory, and they give the address. And in the letter, it says, don't tell anyone I said this. So the National Desertion Bureau has contacts not only in every city in the country that has a Jewish community, but throughout the world. They have contacts everywhere there's a Jewish community. And so what they do is they send a letter to their contact in Los Angeles who initiates an investigation there. But unfortunately, they don't find anything. But what they do hear is a rumor that the couple went to San Francisco. So the National Desertion Bureau sends all the same information, a copy of the application, photograph to their contact in San Francisco, who happens to be a lawyer. He initiates an investigation. And what he finds is that this couple is living in a fruit shop in the town of Alameda, which is a suburb of San Francisco. And they're living in a fruit shop owned by a man whose name is Solomon Garfinkel. And the National Desertion Bureau contacted San Francisco tracks these people for a number of months. And what he discovers is that the three of them are involved in a local free love commune.
What?
Yeah.
Total twist.
Right. And it's 1913. So it's like people are, I guess, a lot more free thinking than
you think.
You give them credit for. So
is it like a Jewish commune?
There's no detail about the commune itself. It may have been. This is not related to this at all, but a few years ago, I wrote an article about a vegetarian nudist colony in New Jersey that was entirely Jewish and Yiddish speaking. And this was it started in 1917. So, there are all kinds of,
Yeah, when there are enough people, there are going to be weird stuff.
People do all kinds of things. And,
vegetarian, nudist, Yiddish speaking.
Right.
Wow.
Right. I can send you a link. It's an unusual story.
So what happens?
So what happens with this couple is that Minnie Schechter, the woman who Nathan ran away with, and they're living in this fruit shop. They're living in this fruit shop owned by Solomon Garfinkel. Also, Solomon Garfinkel's his business card is also in the file. So there's all this detritus related to the case that's in the file that just enriches the story. So what happens is that Minnie falls in love with Solomon Garfinkel, the guy who owns the fruit shop, and they get married. And he moves her out of the fruit shop, and they move into a house in Alameda. So Nathan is furious because he's upended his whole life, left his wife and family in New York for Minnie, and she leaves him for another guy.
He had it coming.
He totally had it coming. So he's mad, and he finds the house they're living in, and he begins to harass them. And he harasses them to a point where they move out of the house into an apartment in San Francisco. But he finds them there too, and he continues to harass them. What they do is they find the lawyer who works as the contact for the National Desertion Bureau in San Francisco, and they say to him, if you threaten to prosecute him for child abandonment, he could be convinced to go back to New York to his wife and children. And that's what they do. The lawyer, sends a letter threatening to prosecute him for child abandonment, but he won't if he reconciles with his wife in New York. And in fact, he goes back to New York and reconciles with his wife. And that's the end of the file. Yeah. And it's such a fascinating story. Within those files, there are all kinds of, I wouldn't say that there are a lot of, love commune stories or free love commune stories. But there are all kinds of stories where people leave for all kinds of different reasons. They wind up in all kinds of different places, whether it's like Cleveland or, I don't know, Baltimore or wherever. And the National Desertion Bureau tracks these people down. And what's amazing, there's a woman who wrote a book about this, the title of which is escaping me. Her name is Anna Igra, I-G-R-A. And she estimated that based on a sample of, I don't know, 300 or 400 cases that she looked at, she estimated that they found the runaway man in about 75% of the cases, which is really kind of a huge number. And they're finding them. There's no internet. There aren't even any phones. Or maybe there are some phones during some period. Yeah, there are phones during some period of it. But it's all through the press. All through newspapers and telegrams and postcards and letters to all kinds of different people. So there are cases, and the contacts vary widely. Like I mentioned that the contact in San Francisco was a lawyer. So I found cases where the National Desertion Bureau's contact was the secretary who worked at the JCC in St. Louis, the Jewish Community Center, or it was like a local rabbi in Nashville. It could have been anybody. It didn't have to be a professional. It was just someone who knew the community. And in immigrant communities, when a new person arrives, people talk. They're like, oh, hey, especially if it's a smaller community. So-and-so showed up. Who is that? It's like someone showing up in the shtetl. It's someone new. Let's talk, we need to talk about this. Where are they coming from? What's their purpose? What are they doing?
Yeah.
And if there's a scandal behind it, it becomes an even bigger topic of conversation.
What happens with, let's say, a story like this couple with the free love commune, which, it's like a soap opera. But what's really interesting is we're getting a part of the story. This woman who was so dependent on her husband, has young children. Her heart is broken. She's being cheated on. She catches her husband in the act and then is left by herself. And then she makes a restaurant, right? She starts to get on her feet. We're seeing her gather the pieces together. She's getting her life together. She's becoming a strong, independent woman. And then this douchebag who betrayed her and harassed someone else, doesn't seem like such a catch, is dragged back into her life.
Right. And so yes, I will also admit that this totally amazes me that they take these guys back who are, so many of them are absolute jerks. It's somewhat astounding. I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of marriage and the place of women in society at that time. Certainly women they worked in sweatshops, but the so-called glass ceiling then was a lot lower, and it wasn't really glass. It was like brick. Women were absolutely limited as to what they could do. And obviously when you have kids, even if both the man and the woman have to work, to have two incomes is important, especially as the kids get older and you don't have to care for them as much. It's, in a way, it's kind of tragic how women were forced to be so reliant on men. But as you say, the fact that this woman, I'm sure she wasn't the first to do it, but that she, came up with this idea of renting a cheap apartment in the neighborhood that had the most Jews in the area and lots of workers, people who needed to eat lunch, especially a kosher lunch, because not all restaurants were, there were certainly kosher restaurants, but you wanted to, and also it's like a home cooked meal. So if she's a good cook, that could be better than a restaurant. And that could be really appealing to people who are having a miserable day in a sweatshop and, want to take a break to eat, a really hearty lunch cooked by, a Yiddish imam.
Yeah.
So that's, I thought it was a really incredibly clever idea and really,
Yeah.
It was something that I hadn't really considered before I saw this card. And that's what's great about these files is they have all these little itchifikas, all these like kind of little items in them that you don't find in normal historical records. So it allows you to extrapolate on historical phenomena like women in society and how do they handle a situation like this. And this is sort of a great example of that type of scenario.
Do you ever, or has anyone attempted to try to get the continuation of stories that end where the file ends?
So I think the only way to do that is to find the families, because once the case files end, that's it.
No more data.
Right. They don't continue. There's no research. There's nothing new. Either the husband reconciles, he doesn't reconcile. Sometimes there are cases where there are guys who constantly reappear. There are people sometimes they've married multiple times, or the same woman multiple times. And so, you see on the application, the first time the woman comes to the office, and then the second time, there could be like months or years in between the times that she shows up to file a new case of abandonment.
What other stories can you tell? I really like the stories.
There are thousands of them, and
this was a very complete one. Like
this is a very complete one, and this is one that I tell a lot, and I tell it because it's such a rich story. There are other stories where they all sort of follow a similar path, where a man leaves, usually a woman with children. She goes and files an application. They initiate an investigation. Sometimes they find the guy living in the tenement building next door. Sometimes they don't find the guy at all. There was one of the cases that we featured in the exhibit was a story of a man who abandoned his wife and never reappeared. And you even have letters in the file from the man's mother begging him to come back to his wife. And he doesn't even respond to his own mother. So there's some cases where the guys are nice. You also have files where there are like receipts for that they're sending into the National Desertion Bureau. The men are sending the National Bureau to show that they're giving the
wives and
children money. And sometimes there are also letters, I wasn't able to pay this week because I'm out of money. It's really, there are thousands of files of like terribly tragic stories.
Yeah.
Because most of these people are very poor. They can't support these families. And then you have these sort of Lotharios who they marry multiple women. They do all kinds of terrible things. And so one of the things that was also interesting about this is finding stories in the papers. I mentioned before that the newspapers become a really important component of this story, because not only because they have this gallery of missing husbands that everybody reads and everyone wants to, find someone in. And it's often one of the ways that the men are discovered. But the papers also have some really, really interesting stories about families like this. And I have a couple here if you want me, I can read them if you think it would be interesting. Here's a story from the Forverts from 1913. It reads as follows. Cigar maker Charles Weiss doesn't look like much, but he apparently knows how to treat the ladies. And, it's funny because the Yiddish press often wrote about things like this, like with tongue in cheek. They write about it with like snark. Some of the stories are written in a really kind of, funny and ironic way.
They probably have a huge readership that's looking out for the
people love reading.
Yeah.
The stories are incredible. I'll just start from the beginning again. So cigar maker Charles Weiss doesn't look like much, but he apparently knows how to treat the ladies. Arrested last week for bigamy, he denied everything. But when he showed up in court to find his 3 wives chatting amongst themselves, he knew he'd been caught. Wife number 1, Annie Heller, married Weiss 3 years ago, but knew him by the name Martin Jambach. The couple has 1 child together. Wife number 2, Lena Weisberger, told the court that she met Charles 6 months ago and was introduced to him with his real name, but also as a widower with 3 children who she has been caring for. Mrs. Weiss number 3, the former Ida Krantz, carried a baby that it turned out belonged to wife number 2. She was married to Weiss just 2 months ago and said that after he sold all her jewelry to fix up the house, he began disappearing. Number 3 became suspicious and followed Weiss to a house in West Harlem, where she discovered that he was living with number 2. When the judge asked Weiss what he had to say, all he could do was mutter, "I'm guilty."
Wow, so much for denying it, huh?
Right, I know. So it's really it's amazing. So here I'll read another one. This one's from 1915. It says Morris Bloomberg, an elderly Jew with a long beard and a regular in the Forverts Gallery of Missing Husbands column, has left his wife again and was in court to explain why. Bloomberg was married 18 years ago and has disappeared a number of times. The last time was 7 years ago, and when he was caught, he was arrested. Although he doesn't deny running away this time, he claims it's his wife's fault and offered 10 reasons as to why. Number 1, she beats him. Number 2, she wouldn't let him read the Sunday paper. Number 3, she made him do his own laundry. Number 4, she stole money from him. Number 5, she broke his glasses. Number 6, she wouldn't let him attend to his business. Number 7, she wouldn't do his laundry. Obviously, laundry's in there twice, so important to...
It's a big issue. It's a big issue.
Right. Number 8, she demanded that he wash the windows. Number 9, she didn't love him. Number 10, her mother always stuck her nose in their business. The case is expected to go to the jury today. It's like...
And all his reasons are equally...
No, obviously not. But it's funny that this guy shows up in court with a list of reasons thinking, oh, well, this is going to make my case for me. It's, these people, they often weren't the most brilliant of folks. It's just the reality of how that works.
He could have bothered to notice the duplicate on the laundry, but yeah. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
No. So, the papers are just full of stories like this. And, from a historian's perspective, they're just this incredibly fascinating perspective into, the personal lives of Jewish immigrants. And it's something you don't really get anywhere else. I mean, certainly, writers and novelists have written, things like this. I mean, in the book I published a number of years ago, Bad Rabbi, I have a chapter that's about the Warsaw Rabbinical Court. And that was also a commonly featured thing in the Yiddish press in Poland, the cases of the Rabbinical Court, and especially divorce cases. And they were so popular that there was even a Yiddish stage play made about the Beis Din, about the divorce cases in the Rabbinical Court, because they were just such rich stories of, they were often violent. There was lots of screaming and yelling. They were very, very dramatic. And so it's just another instance of how the press figures into the lives of these people and sort of brings it to life for a different audience. Obviously, it's, the purpose of the press at the time was to bring it to life for a contemporary audience. For me, it's like, I will say, ich habe reingefallen in a Schmalzgrube, which is sort of untranslatable. But it's like I fell into this incredibly rich,
juicy,
topic that is historically fascinating and dramatic and compelling, and also gives insight into the lives of common people, which, like I said, is something you don't really get in many other places.
Yeah. Speaking of like juicy and dramatic, something that I am wondering about, maybe this is just an information bias, in stories about immigrants in the Lower East Side, there seems to be a lot of philandering. I don't know. This is probably an information bias. But I'm just wondering, a thought in my mind is if the upheaval of relocating with a family makes you question everything and causes maybe more of that kind of sexual energy.
I mean, I don't know if it causes sexual energy.
Or rethinking partnerships more like.
Yeah, I mean, look, yes, I think that, this was a massive social and cultural upheaval. You're in an entirely new place. You are also the typical Lower East Side or New York City tenement apartment was, I think, 300 square feet. The average family had 6 kids, and that's cramped. That's not, even if you like the people, you're there all the time. It's like you can't move, you can't turn around without someone being there. That's a hard way to live. And so, and being men, they see an opportunity and they take it. And and the unfortunate aspect is that in many cases, it broke up families and did damage. So it's, and obviously the Jewish community recognized this and as a result created the National Desertion Bureau in order to deal with it. Now, obviously, and also interestingly, I should also add that the National Desertion Bureau was open to anyone. They didn't, you didn't have to be Jewish to use it. But because it was a Jewish organization funded by the Jewish community, at least up through the 1930s, the vast majority of clients are Jews. By the 90s, when Jews begin to enter the middle classes in much larger numbers, that begins to change. And so from 1950s through, and they function until the 1960s. You just see all kinds of different people, entering into the files. You still, wind up with Jews during these times, but, they're no longer I don't think they're a majority any longer, because once you're in the middle class, it's no longer, you have the financial wherewithal to actually pay for a divorce. And in fact, in the early 20th century, family abandonment was often called poor man's divorce. This is, hiring a lawyer, getting a divorce, that costs money. And Jews have to do it twice. They have to, if they got married civilly, they have to get a civil divorce, and they also have to get a get, which also costs money. And so it's, by abandonment, they avoided all of this and just disappeared. But like I said, when you get to Jews becoming middle class, they handle it, in the appropriate fashion. They go to a lawyer, they get a divorce.
Yeah. Imagine also that at the time, let's say in the early 1900s, child support was a thing, was it? In a divorce?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, one of the outcomes of the National Desertion Bureau's activities was the development of something called family court, where these cases often appeared. And the people in family court works hand in hand with the National Desertion Bureau in cases where where couples do want to get divorced. For instance, if a couple wants a divorce, the National Desertion Bureau will help them do it. And one of the interesting aspects of this is, earlier on I mentioned the fact that, this problem of family abandonment was, it's really a problem of poverty. It's a problem of social, of finances. And it affected Italian and Irish immigrants in the same ways that it affected Jews. But because most Italians and Irish are Catholic, they can't get divorced. The church handles this problem for them, but the church won't allow them to get divorced. So they force, marriages that are bad marriages to stay together, because that's considered a holy union. And so to a certain degree for Jews, they're in a much better situation because, according to their tradition, they are able to get divorced, especially in situations where the marriage is.
Yeah. Interesting. Last question. The YIVO exhibit obviously popularized this whole fascinating saga. Was there at any point in your working on this project that you heard from someone who is a descendant from anyone in this story?
No, but I had a lot of people contact me asking if they were. Because one of the things that YIVO has as part of its archives is a card catalog that belonged to the National Desertion Bureau. So if you had a case filed with the National Desertion Bureau and they needed to access your file, they had a special card catalog, like in the library, where you'd 3x5 cards with the basic information about the family. So people always used to ask me if I could check the card catalog to find their, great-grandfather, to see if they were in there. And I didn't really find anything. But one time there's a person in YIVO's orbit who does a lot of YIVO activities, who mentioned that her grandfather had abandoned their family. And we looked it up, and in fact, her grandfather had a file.
Wow.
There are cases like this. And also, one interesting thing, the Jewish board put that card catalog online. And so you can actually look it up online to see if you had a relative in this. And then if you, in fact, you do, you note the case number on the card and you come to YIVO and you order the file. And I think it takes a day or two to get the actual file, but you can look at it. In addition, someone from the genealogical organization Jewish Gen created a database of apparently all of the men in the gallery of missing husbands. So if you suspect that you had a philandering Zadie for a Grois Zadie, you can go to Jewish Gen and look this up. If you find something, it's likely that the National Desertion Bureau.
Wow, fascinating. Is the exhibit still up?
No, sorry. The exhibit went down about a year ago.
Yeah, I thought so. I remember it was a while ago.
Topic that people still talk about a lot.
How can people learn more about it, or maybe learn more about your work if they're intrigued?
Well, they could look at YIVO's website, yivo.org. That has all of our events and exhibits and classes and, various other online projects as part of the website. I mean, YIVO has something like 24 million documents and artifacts that relate to mostly Ashkenazi Jew and sort of Eastern European Jewish life, but we have a lot of other things as well. We have a library of about, between 300,000 and 400,000 volumes, lots of rare rabbinic material, the archives and the archives, they're just so rich. It's just, there's so many different things ranging from, the archives of Yiddish writers and artists to Jewish organizations to, the Vad HaRabbonim in Vilna. I mean, it's like there's Yiddish school systems in Poland between the wars. It's such a great collection, and it's open to the public. So you can just, come here and find some fascinating topic to work on and research and anything that interests you. And
beautiful.
Now also, if people want to learn more about the National Desertion Bureau, about, how it functioned and what it did, they can look up Anna Igra's book. I want to say it's like,
I'll link it. I'll link it.
You can link it
in the video description. Yeah, I'll just find it and I'll link it. Great. Thank you so much, Eddy. I really, really enjoyed learning from you.
I hope it wasn't boring.
Boring? How can it be boring? How can it be boring? I feel like we could be talking about the stories that are found. I personally, as someone who's interested in culture, have always been fascinated by ordinary people's lives. It's just something that really interests me. And of course,
look, ordinary people are incredibly fascinating. You don't have to be or have, been, wildly successful in something, or a singer or a writer or whatever. People are just interesting.
Exactly.
Whoever you're sitting next to on the bus or on the subway could be, someone who's got this really compelling, dramatic story. And, obviously you don't want to pry, but sometimes it's worth it.
Yeah, exactly. I love people watching, but sometimes the only way to really get to these ordinary people's stories is like historical.
Yeah.
Piecing together what we can find. Well, thank you again so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to link your book, Bad Rabbi, and also the YIVO website in the video description. And also thank you to the viewers and the podcast listeners.
Right. Thanks to everyone who might watch this.